I had this freak accident at work, and for a moment, everything went black. They said if I'd hit my head a little harder, things could have ended very differently. But after a couple of days in the hospital, I made it out okay. When I got home, all I wanted was to see my wife, Karen, and feel like I still had something solid to come back to. I thought this experience might bring us closer together, make us appreciate what we have. But that's when life hit me with a sucker punch I never saw coming. After a day or two of being home, I noticed Karen acting strange. She'd been distant for a while now, spending a lot of late nights out with friends, or getting defensive anytime I asked who she was with. I had just chalked it up to a rough patch. I mean, every couple has those, right? But recovering from that accident, I was in a place where I needed her support more than ever. Instead, she was dodging me, giving me these half-hearted smiles, and keeping her phone practically glued to her hand. It felt like she was a million miles away. Then, yesterday, I found out why. I was still pretty sore, so I'd stayed home, resting on the couch, while Karen said she was going out to get groceries. An hour passed, then two. Something wasn't adding up. My gut was churning, and before I even knew what I was doing, I picked up her tablet from the kitchen counter. Karen and I have always been open with each other's devices, or at least that's what I thought. When I opened her messages, I saw a text from my brother, Jake. Now, let me say up front, Jake and I have never been super close, but he's my brother. The one person I'd never think twice about trusting. But there it was, a long string of messages, and I didn't need to scroll far to see what they were really about. I'll be honest with you. I stared at that screen, hoping I was somehow reading it wrong. My mind went blank, my hands felt cold, and my pulse was racing. But there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The words on the screen weren't some harmless banter between siblings-in-law. It was a full-on confession, a trail of messages that told me everything I didn't want to know. I saw things I wish I could unsee. Texts that painted a picture of nights they'd spent together, sneaking around while I was at work, or, worse, that weekend I was in the hospital. My own brother. The same guy who brought me lunch when I was lying there in that hospital bed. I couldn't believe it. I mean, my mind kept trying to find some explanation, some way to twist this into a bad joke. But the truth was there, staring me in the face. I kept reading, feeling like I was in a daze. Last night was incredible. One of her texts to him said, "But we have to be more careful. Tom's getting suspicious." And it hit me hard. The signs had been there all along. All those times I'd asked Karen what was going on and she'd shrugged it off, rolling her eyes or laughing like I was some paranoid fool. She'd been lying to me, straight to my face, and with my own brother. A part of me wanted to throw the tablet across the room, but I needed more. I needed to understand how long this had been going on. So I scrolled further, piecing together a timeline that I could barely stomach. It looked like they'd been seeing each other behind my back for almost a year. A year. While I'd been doing everything I could to be a good husband, she was sharing things with my brother that I thought were ours alone. And that's when I heard the door open. Karen was back from grocery shopping, as she called it. The sound snapped me back to reality, and I quickly closed the messages and set the tablet down, trying to keep my breathing steady. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she'd hear it. But I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with first. So instead, I played it cool. I forced a smile, asked her if she found everything she needed, watching her face as she casually strolled into the kitchen, putting the grocery bags down on the counter. She looked at me with that same fake, innocent smile I'd seen 1,000 times, and I wondered how much more she was hiding beneath it. I kept it together, but inside, I was a volcano ready to erupt. But the time for that would come soon enough. For now, I had to plan my next move. That night, I barely slept. My mind was racing, replaying every moment over the last year, trying to fit the pieces together. I thought back to all the girls' nights she claimed to have, all the times she'd come home late with some excuse that sounded just a little too rehearsed. And then there was Jake, my own brother, who'd always found a reason to dodge family gatherings recently, who'd started acting weird around Karen whenever we were all in the same room. How could I have missed it? By the next morning, I knew I had to dig deeper. I needed more than a string of texts. I needed something undeniable. So while Karen was in the shower, I went back to her tablet and decided to check her email and social media accounts. Maybe I was wrong to snoop, but at that point, I figured I had the right to know the whole truth. Within minutes, I struck gold, or rather, the dirt. There were countless email exchanges between her and Jake, messages filled with things I never thought I'd see her say, stuff that was far too intimate, way beyond anything that could be written off as innocent. There were photos, too. They'd even gone on a trip together last month while I thought she was at a work conference. As I was scrolling through one of the emails, she came out of the bathroom, and I had to close the tablet fast. My heart nearly stopped when I heard her footsteps approaching. But instead of coming toward me, she went straight to the bedroom. I heard her humming to herself as she got dressed, completely oblivious to the fact that her whole charade was starting to crumble. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but I decided against it. I needed more time to think, to process all of this before I did anything I'd regret. So, instead, I set up a plan to catch her red-handed. I told her I'd have to work late the next few nights, figuring she might take that as her opportunity to sneak off with Jake again. Sure enough, by the second night, my suspicions paid off. I drove to Jake's place, parked a block away, and waited. Sure enough, Karen's car pulled up not 10 minutes later. I watched as she knocked on his door, and he let her in, grinning like they were teenagers sneaking around for the thrill of it. I'd expected to feel anger, or maybe heartbreak watching it happen right in front of me. But honestly, I just felt numb. I stayed in the car, barely breathing, as I waited to see what they'd do next. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that this was it. This was my proof. They'd betrayed me right down to the last detail, and there was nothing left to wonder about. As I drove away, I started planning out exactly how I'd confront her. This time, she wouldn't get away with it. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd crossed some kind of invisible line. There was no turning back now. I'd seen the truth with my own eyes, and there was no escaping it. So I waited until Karen came home from her yoga class, and I sat her down at the kitchen table. I could see her relax when she saw I was just sitting there, looking calm. I think she figured that I'd bought into all her lies and was none the wiser. But as soon as she sat down, I slid her tablet across the table, opened to one of her emails with Jake. Her eyes went wide, and she shot up from the chair, trying to grab it, but I held it back. "What's this, Karen?" I asked, as calmly as I could manage. I wanted to yell, to scream, but I knew if I started that way, she'd just start making excuses or spin more lies. She was good at that. She froze, just staring at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to find words. "Tom, she started, but I cut her off. "Save it, Karen. I know everything. The late nights, the work trips, the texts. I know all of it. And with my own brother, no less." My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. This wasn't the woman I thought I'd married. And just like that, her expression changed. The shock melted into anger. "Well, maybe if you weren't always so busy or distracted, I wouldn't have had to go somewhere else," she snapped. Her tone was icy, like this was somehow my fault. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind flashed back to every late shift, every weekend I'd spent working so we could save up for a house, every moment I'd given up to provide for us. "So, you're saying this is my fault?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're blaming me for you sleeping with my brother?" "Honestly, yeah. I mean, look at yourself, Tom. You're always stressed, always so focused on work that you don't even see what's right in front of you." She laughed bitterly. "Jake was there for me when you weren't. And maybe if you'd bothered to pay attention, you would have seen that you were pushing me away." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew I'd been busy, but I'd never once thought that my efforts to build a future for us would somehow push her into my brother's arms. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel a shred of love left in me. Just a strange, hollow feeling. "So, that's it?" I asked, barely holding back the emotion in my voice. "After everything, you're just going to pin this on me and walk away like none of it was your fault?" She shrugged, crossing her arms, looking at me like I was just some inconvenience standing in her way. "I don't know, Tom. Maybe it's just time we both face the truth. This marriage hasn't been working for a long time. You were just too blind to see it." With that, She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me there, stunned, wondering if any of it had ever been real. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep holding on to something that had already slipped away. After Karen walked out of the room, I just sat there, trying to make sense of it all. Her words replayed in my head, twisting the knife deeper with every echo. It felt like she'd shattered the last piece of what we'd built, leaving nothing but a mess of broken trust and betrayal. I thought maybe, just maybe, there'd be some remorse, some glimmer of regret in her eyes. But there was nothing, just indifference. But it didn't stop there. Later that night, when I was trying to gather my thoughts, she came back into the living room, casually scrolling through her phone. She looked at me like she was deciding what to order for dinner, not like she just admitted to cheating on me with my own brother. I couldn't take it anymore. So that's it? You're just going to pretend like none of this matters? She sighed, looking more annoyed than anything. Look, Tom, I'm done with the drama, okay? Maybe it's best if we take a break, some space to figure out what we really want. A break? I asked, my voice cracking. You've been on a break with my brother behind my back for nearly a year. What more space do you need? She rolled her eyes, her hand resting on her hip. Fine, if you want to be technical about it. Maybe it's best if one of us stays somewhere else for a while. I don't think this arrangement is working anymore. I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from absolute disbelief. So you're kicking me out? From the home I built for us? She shrugged again, like it was just a minor inconvenience. Look, if it makes things easier, I'll go stay with a friend for a while. But you need to think about what you really want here. This can't keep going on like this. And then, with no more than a quick glance in my direction, she headed upstairs to pack a bag. I sat there, stunned, realizing how cold and calculating she'd become. But it got worse. A few minutes later, she walked down the stairs, her phone buzzing in her hand. She looked at the screen and smirked. "Jake's coming to pick me up," she said, slipping her shoes on like she didn't have a care in the world. My heart sank. Jake? My own brother was coming to pick up my wife after everything? I felt a wave of anger, sadness, and disgust all at once, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. And all I could do was watch as she walked out the door, disappearing into the night like everything we had was nothing more than a fleeting memory. The front door closed, and I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. She'd not only betrayed me, but had the nerve to leave with the very person she'd betrayed me with. That's when I knew. I wasn't going to sit around and be her fool anymore. The silence in the house was suffocating after she left. I couldn't just sit there and let this betrayal eat me alive. I knew I had to take some control back, to get a grip on my life before it unraveled completely. So, I called up my old friend Dave, one of the few people who'd stood by me through thick and thin. If anyone could help me figure out my next move, it was him. "Tom?" he answered, sounding surprised. "Man, it's been a while. What's going on?" I didn't hold back. I told him everything. Karen, Jake, the texts, her walking out with my brother like I meant nothing to her. He stayed silent on the other end, but I could almost feel the anger building in him. "That's low, even for Karen," he finally muttered, and I could tell he was trying to hold back. "Yeah," I said, my voice heavy with bitterness. "I need to do something, Dave. I can't just sit here and let her walk all over me. Not after all this." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "All right, here's what you're going to do. You're not going to let her win. You're going to protect what's yours. I know a good lawyer, and I know how these things go. Don't let her get the upper hand. Get everything ready, get evidence of what she's done, and don't let her spin this against you." It was like a light switched on. I'd been sitting here, letting the shock and pain eat at me, while she was probably already planning her next move with Jake. So, I spent the next couple of hours combing through every last message, every email, every scrap of proof that would paint the full picture. I saved everything, then backed it up twice for good measure. I knew I'd need every bit of it if I was going to walk away from this with my head held high. I'd just finished when I heard a knock at the door. My heart froze. It was late. Who'd be here at this hour? But then I saw who it was through the window. My brother Jake. I opened the door, and there he was, looking as smug as ever, as if he had some right to be on my doorstep after everything he'd done. "Tom, can we talk?" he said, like he was trying to play the role of the concerned brother. I crossed my arms, blocking the doorway. "You've got some nerve showing up here, Jake," he sighed, giving me a look like I was the one overreacting. "Look, I know you're upset, but Karen and we just felt something real. I can't help it if—" I cut him off. "Something real? You're talking about my wife, Jake. We were family." He looked away, like he couldn't even meet my eyes. But I could tell he was used to getting his way, used to talking his way out of trouble. He took a step toward me, but I didn't budge. "You know what, Jake?" I said, my voice deadly calm. "You and Karen can have each other. But don't expect me to stand by while you ruin what I've worked for." He gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. Maybe it was a flicker of guilt, but I doubted it. "We didn't mean for this to happen, Tom. But maybe you should ask yourself why it did." Those words hit hard, but I didn't show it. I'd heard enough. I shut the door in his face, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as I locked it. This was my life, my home, and they weren't going to steal that from me. With my proof gathered and a plan forming, I was ready to take the next steps. It was no longer about Karen, or Jake, or what they thought they had together. It was about getting my life back, no matter how far they tried to push me down. After Jake left, I finally felt a sliver of control. But as the hours stretched on, the anger that had kept me going started to mix with an ache I hadn't prepared for. It was one thing to lose a wife. It was another to lose a brother. But every time I thought about it, I reminded myself of what they'd done. They weren't the people I thought they were. The next morning, I made an appointment with Dave's lawyer. I walked in ready to do whatever it took to protect what I'd worked for, but as soon as I started explaining my situation, I could see the lawyer's face harden. "Infidelity cases are tough," she said, "but with your evidence and a good approach, we can make sure you walk away with what you deserve." She advised me to go about things quietly for now. Karen didn't know I'd been to see a lawyer, and I planned to keep it that way. I wanted the upper hand, something that was finally within my control. I was to play it cool, not to raise suspicions, and make sure everything I needed was lined up. But just when I thought I had it all mapped out, an unexpected message popped up on my phone that afternoon. It was from my cousin Mark, who I hadn't spoken to in a while. His text was short but chilling. "Hey, heard some things about Karen and Jake. Give me a call when you can." A cold knot twisted in my stomach as I dialed his number. When he picked up, his voice sounded wary, almost like he didn't want to be the one to tell me. "Tom, look, I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should know. Karen's been telling everyone you were the one cheating. She's saying you're the one who stepped out, and that's why she's found comfort with Jake." The world went silent. She was telling people I'd cheated? The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive, in a twisted way. "Are you serious?" I asked, barely keeping my anger in check. "Yeah, man. I wouldn't believe it myself if I didn't hear it from so many people. But she's been going around saying she had to find someone she could trust after what you supposedly did." Mark paused. "I figured you should know what's going on behind your back." I thanked him and hung up, feeling my blood boil. Not only had she betrayed me with my own brother, but now she was smearing my name to anyone who'd listen. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever thought possible, and it was spreading like poison. As I sat there, I realized that if I was going to make it through this, I'd need to outsmart them both. I couldn't just sit back and let her rewrite history. This wasn't just about a broken heart anymore. It was about protecting my reputation, my dignity. I'd worked hard to be a good husband, to build a life worth something, and I wasn't about to let them tear that down. From that moment, I made a promise to myself. I'd fight back, but I'd do it smartly, calculatedly. There was one person in this mess who wasn't going to get walked all over, and that was me. With Karen out there spinning lies and turning the story on its head, I knew I had to think fast. Letting her drag my name through the mud while she cozied up with Jake wasn't something I could sit back and watch. I decided to take matters into my own hands, but this time, I'd hit her where she wouldn't see it coming. After talking to Dave's lawyer again, I got an idea. I'd play it cool, let her think I was the one crushed by the situation, oblivious to her scheming. I kept our communication to a minimum, responding to her messages about bills or mundane household matters with short, neutral replies. I didn't react to her provocations, her barbs, or even the snide remarks she sent about how she'd moved on. If she wanted to believe I was devastated and clueless, I was happy to let her think that. Then, out of nowhere, Karen called me one night. I wasn't expecting it. After weeks of radio silence outside of logistics, her name suddenly lighting up my screen felt surreal. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, almost feeling my pulse quicken. This was the first time she was reaching out on her own, not to talk about bills or shared accounts, but to actually talk. I picked up, keeping my voice calm. "Yeah, Tom, I just think it's time we talk," she said, her tone surprisingly soft. It sounded rehearsed, like she was reading lines she practiced over and over. About everything that happened. "All right," I replied, keeping my cool. "Talk." There was a silence on the line before she started in, telling me that she didn't mean for things to go this way, and that sometimes people drift apart. The way she spoke made it sound like we'd just grown apart, like I hadn't caught her tangled up with my own brother. But the real kicker came a moment later. "Tom, I just want us to be civil about this. For both of our sakes. No need to make things ugly." Ugly? She was the one twisting the knife, and then acting like I was the one holding the blade. But I kept my voice steady, even giving her a light, almost patronizing laugh. "I don't think you need to worry about me making it ugly, Karen. I'd say you're doing a pretty good job of that all by yourself." She hesitated, but then her voice took on an edge. "I hope you're not planning to make things difficult, Tom. I think it'd be best if we both just moved on quietly." "Quietly?" I repeated, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. "Sure, Karen. You've got my word on that." When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I could tell she was starting to worry. Maybe she'd heard from friends who weren't buying her stories, or maybe she was afraid I'd air her dirty laundry in court. Either way, she was losing the upper hand, and it was rattling her. That night, I made a decision. I'd follow through on my plan, but I wouldn't give her or Jake the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I'd handle it quietly, just like she wanted. Or at least that's what I'd let her think. It was time to build my case, one quiet step at a time. And when the moment was right, I'd make sure both of them realized just how big a mistake they'd made. Days passed in a blur of half-hearted conversations with Karen, casual exchanges that felt like they were laced with venom just beneath the surface. I kept everything buttoned up, acting like I was just some broken guy trying to get over it. But in reality, I was plotting my next move, waiting for the perfect time to hit back. The lawyers were working on a strategy, gathering evidence, and everything seemed like it was on track. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a piece of the puzzle. Then, one evening, as I was going over my paperwork, something unexpected happened. I got a text from an unknown number. "Tom, you need to meet me. It's about Karen and Jake. I have something you need to know. It's urgent." The message was short and cryptic, but the desperation in it made my stomach drop. I didn't recognize the number, but the familiar weight of betrayal made me hesitate for only a moment. I didn't want to be led into some trap, but the curiosity and dread gnawed at me, so I responded. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "You don't know me, but I know you. I have something that could change everything." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet. I arranged to meet the person in a quiet bar, the kind of place where secrets were exchanged under the buzz of neon lights and low murmurs. When I arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. The person who stood up to greet me was a woman in her 30s, wearing a plain blue sweater and jeans, looking out of place in the dimly lit atmosphere. She gestured for me to sit, and I took a deep breath before sliding into the booth. "You're Tom, right?" she asked, her voice calm but shaking. "You need to know something. It's about your wife and your brother." I swallowed hard. I already know about them. It's all come out. She looked at me with pity. "Not everything. There's something you're not seeing. Karen didn't just cheat with Jake. She's been working with him on something bigger than you realize." My heart started to pound as the words sunk in. What could be bigger than an affair? Was she trying to make it sound more dramatic than it was? I leaned forward, my instincts on high alert. "What are you talking about?" "I've been following them for months," she said, glancing over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "Jake's been running a scam with Karen. They've been taking money from you, using your accounts, your investments, your savings. It wasn't just sex. They'd been stealing from you while you were none the wiser. My mind raced as the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was a betrayal of trust, of everything I'd worked for. Karen, the woman I'd loved and built a life with, had been plotting behind my back for months. And Jake, my own brother, had been helping her every step of the way. The woman slid a folder across the table, her hands trembling. This is everything I've gathered. I couldn't just stand by and watch them destroy you. I don't want any part of this anymore, but you need to know the truth. I flipped the folder open, my hands shaking as I scanned the documents. Bank statements, wire transfers, receipts, proof of their involvement in a conspiracy that went far deeper than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. It was about a calculated plan to ruin me, to take everything I had. I felt a rage so hot, it burned through me. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make them feel the weight of what they'd done. But there was no time for that. The shock and disbelief hit me, but more than that, I realized that I had to be careful now. This wasn't just an emotional fight anymore. It was a fight for everything I had. I've got what I need, I told the woman, my voice steady. Thank you for showing me this. She nodded, her eyes full of regret. I'm sorry it had to be this way. I never wanted to get involved, but I couldn't keep living with this. I left the bar that night with a clear plan. I wasn't going to rush into anything, but I knew now that I had leverage. Karen and Jake had underestimated me, thinking I was just some heartbroken guy they could walk all over. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had a choice, and I'd make it count. I never saw the woman again, but the next few days were filled with quiet strategy. I reached out to my lawyer, and together, we made a plan to expose them, to make them face the full consequences of their actions, not just the affair, but the financial scheme they'd been running on me for months. The confrontation came when Karen least expected it. I laid out everything. The affair, the money they'd been siphoning, the lies, the manipulation, and as I watched her face pale and her eyes flicker with panic, I knew that everything was about to change. But it wasn't the emotional explosion I thought it would be. Instead of the fight I'd expected, Karen collapsed, her defenses shattered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she sobbed. I never wanted it to get this far. I don't know what happened. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt exhausted, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was there until it was finally lifted. As I walked away from the wreckage of my marriage and my brother's betrayal, I realized that I wasn't the same man I used to be. I'd been hurt, humiliated, and betrayed. But in the end, I had the power to decide how I moved forward. And that was something no one could ever take from me.